Today I will be talking about the psychoacoustic performance and music and speech perception in prelingually deafened children with cochlear implants. So some background information is that the number of pediatric cochlear implant recipients has increased substantially over the past 10 years. So it has definitely become more important to understand these underlying mechanisms in this population. However, relatively few studies have been done with these investigations involving prelingually deafened children using cochlear implants. So, the research question slash hypothesis is to be able to measure spectral and temporal sensitivity, speech perception abilities in quiet and in background noise, and music perception abilities in prelingually deafened children with cochlear implants and compare those results to published data on adults who were postlingually deafened and subsequently implanted. A secondary goal of this test was to examine relationships between the spectral slash temporal sensitivities and speech and music perception abilities. Methods. So the test subjects were 11 prelingually deafened cochlear implant users, and they were recruited from the Seattle Children's Hospital. There were 7 males and four females, and their ages ranged from 8 to 16 years. There were certain criteria that the children had to meet, and that was they had to be implanted before the age of 5. And all subjects were native English speakers and bilaterally deafened and had no residual hearing in either ear. For the test administrations, all the children listened to the stimuli using their own sound processor set to a comfortable listening level. The bilateral users were tested with their first implanted ear only. All tests were conducted in a double-walled sound-treated booth, and the duration of the entire test only took approximately 2 hours. So in this chart, this explains the demographics of prelingually deafened test subjects. So this is just a chart describing the children. So the first is their subject ID, how old they are, the gender, the age that they were implanted, the duration of how long they had the cochlear implant, the etiology, the device they're using, their processor, and the current educational environment. So the M means mainstream education. So all these children have mainstream education, with the exception of the school for hearing impaired child. But most of the children are in mainstream education, and some have sign interpretation, captioning, and interpretation. So these are the first two tests that were performed. The first one is a spectral ripple discrimination test, and this test evaluates the listener's ability to discriminate between standard and inverted ripple spectrum. The ripple stimuli were generated by summing 200 pure tone frequency components. The stimuli had a total duration of 500 milliseconds and were ramped with a rise/fall time of 150 milliseconds. Each 500 millisecond stimuli was either a standard reference stimulus or inverted ripple phase reverse test stimulus. The next test is the Schroeder phase discrimination, and this is used to evaluate the acoustic temporal fine structure sensitivity in normal hearing and hearing impaired listeners. This test consisted of positive and negative Schroeder phase stimulus, and it had two different fundamental frequencies of 50 and 200 hertz. These frequencies were chosen because the 50 and 200 hertz scores can access a wide range of cochlear implant listeners' performances on the test, and because they correlate with a variety of clinical outcome measures. So together, these two tests allow the evaluation of spectral and temporal sensitivity in such children and displays the similarity and differences between prelingually deafened children and postlingually deafened adults in their speech and music perception abilities. The other tests that were used were the CNC word recognition test, and this is a consonant nucleus consonant, is what the CNC stands for. So 50 consonant nucleus consonant monosyllabic words from a recorded CD with a male talker were presented from an open set in sound field at 65 dBA. Each CNC word list was randomly chosen out of 10 lists for each subject. A total percent correct score was calculated as the percent of words correctly repeated. And another test is the speech reception threshold. The subjects were asked to identify one randomly chosen spondee word out of a closed set of 12 equally difficult spondees in the presence of background noise. The spondees are two-syllable words with equal emphasis on each syllable, and they were recorded by a female talker. The last test was the CAMP test, and this was used for music testing. Three components of music perception, such as pitch, melody, and timbre recognition, were assembled into a computer-driven exercise. Each subject, each subtest began with a brief training session in which the subjects were able to familiarize themselves with the test items and protocol. The first was the complex pitch direction discrimination, and this required the students to identify which of the two complex tones has the higher frequency. The dependent variable of this test was the just noticeable difference threshold in semitones determined using a one up, one down tracking procedure. The another subtest was the melody identification, and the melody test uses synthesized piano-like tones which have identical envelopes. The students were asked to identify melodies by selecting the title corresponding to the melodies presented. The primary dependent variable was a total percent correct score calculated after 36 melody presentations, including 3 presentations of each melody. The last subtest was the timbre identification, which is also known as musical instrument. There were 8 musical instruments presented, each playing the same recorded melody composed of 5 notes, and they were presented 3 times in random orders. The instruments that were used were the piano, trumpet, clarinet, saxophone, flute, violin, cello, and guitar. The presented level was 65 dBA. The subjects were instructed to select the labeled icon of the instrument corresponding to the timbre presented. The primary dependent variable was a total percent correct score calculated after 24 presentations, including 3 presentations of each instrument. So what you're looking at right now is the results, and this is just a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about right now. I'm going to go more in depth between each test and like each results from those tests. So for the first test was the spectral verbal discrimination, and the findings were that the children and adults, there was really no statistical difference between the two. However, in the Schroeder phase discrimination, with the 50 and the 200 hertz, in both those tests, the child subjects were worse at both frequencies. The CNC word recognition test, um, the children's results was nearly identical to the adults' results. And then the next test was the SRT, speech recognition threshold, and those tests were also very similar to those of the adults. And the next tests were the music perception test. So the first subtest was the complex pitch discrimination test, and there was no significant difference between the children and adults. The next subtest was the melody identification, and The statistical comparison between children and adults was not conducted because the children's performance was not significantly different from the chance level. The last subtest was the timbre identification, and this was another test that the children's results were significantly worse than those of the adults. The children's subjects recognized the guitar most often at 55% and the flute least often at 15%. Um, the children often thought that the flute was the violin. So the two tests that they were significantly worse were the Schroeder and the timbre identification. But all other test results, the children were almost statistically similar to those of the adults. So some strengths of this report was that there were multiple tests done, as I described before. There was the spectral ripple, Schroeder phase, CNC word recognition, the SRT, and the CAMP tests. And the subjects did have to go, there were certain requirements for those test subjects, and the familiarity with certain instruments when doing the CAMP test did not play a role in timbre because, as in the chart showed, that the children were all in um, a mainstream education, meaning they were all exposed to these musics in an early education. They were all exposed to the musical instruments in this early education. The weaknesses, however, is that the results may have been influenced by the delayed maturation in the children's temporal processing abilities. So, in conclusion, the identical spectral ripple threshold and the worst Schroeder phase discrimination score support the thought that the outcome of the children's results may have to do more with their spectral sensitivity. The test results in children may improve after their temporal sensitivity has matured. And this hypothesis can be tested in the future as they grow older and as they mature more and as their temporal sensitivity matures more. So basically, all of the tests that were done on the children, um, the ones that came back worse than the adults have to do with their temporal sensitivity and it not being as mature as the adults. And that's it. Here's the works cited, and hope you enjoyed.